Well, hello everybody. Pastor Joel here with you one more time on The Past Days with Pastor Joel. Well, just a bit of housekeeping. I've been saying in some of my previous videos that if you are subscriber 125, you could let me know that you were subscriber 125 by either leaving a comment on one of my videos, or you could find me on Facebook and let me know that, and then you could let me know which video you wanted me to do. In other words, what video would you like me to make? However, we seem to be stuck. Like, we were at 121 subscribers and it went up to 122. Somebody left. Can you believe it? Who would leave my channel? But they did, so we're back at 121. And actually, we were growing pretty regularly until I offered something for subscriber 125. So you know what? Subscriber 125, forget it. You know what you're gonna get? Goose egg, nothing, zilch, nada. And maybe now our subscribers will grow. At any rate, just having a little fun here. I do appreciate all the very kind comments and feedback, and please do like, subscribe, share this content, get it to people who may have a very different view too. I like to engage with them as well. And this video that I'm starting is probably going to be a little series of videos. Something I'm super excited about is I've written a book. I'm kind of in the final editing, rewriting stages of that, and I'll let you know when that's going to be coming out. A bulk of it's been done for a long time, but just it wasn't the right time to get it out there. But it's called Seismic Shift, a Pastor's End Times Trek. I'm super excited about it, and I'll be telling you more about that when we get a little bit closer to releasing it. But at any rate, some of this material in this series of videos is taken from that book, and a couple of the chapters in that book, I wanted to explore why do we tend to believe what we believe about the end times. And there's one view that's definitely more pervasive, more widely taught, we might say more popular, and some of you are already going to know a lot of this material, but for others it might help. And again, one of the things I'm hoping is that as I teach this content, I'm teaching in a way that then you can take what you've learned and teach it to others. And so some of what I'm doing here may be a little bit more basic, a little bit more simple on this topic than others might do, but that's kind of intentional. And this book that I mentioned is written more from a personal perspective of what happened to me, what scriptures did I see, and what started taking place in my mind that changed my view. And essentially, I'm wanting this book to be an on-ramp for people who may be asking questions, and maybe particularly people that are coming from what's called a dispensational eschatological framework, which a lot of you will know what that is. If you don't, you'll know more about that as I go through this series of videos. But I was really intentional with that in the book, and therefore in these videos, this series of videos that's going to be from part of that book, is making it kind of a more personal story of this is the way I thought about it. Essentially, I want to be your eschatological tour guide, and so that you can also teach these things to other people. And you may find another approach that works better, but maybe this is something that you might want to start with. And so essentially, why do so many people believe something very similar about the end times? How did we get here? All right, and the main events that would be part of what's called the dispensational understanding of eschatology, and really dispensationalism, in my opinion, is not really only merely a view on eschatology, but it's a whole way of interpreting the Bible. Again, it's very pervasive, very popular in the academic and scholarly circles. To be honest, it's pretty dead there, and it's not really being acknowledged much, but it is still being very much acknowledged by many pastors, local churches, parachurch ministries. I mean, some of the main teachers that you might see online would be John MacArthur, Greg Laurie would certainly be in there. Oh my goodness, Jack Hibbs, I was forgetting his name, and some other the big name guys, and they're doing these videos and getting hundreds of thousands of hits. A lot of them are coming from this particular teaching, so it's still very relevant in our culture. And so I think that's why so many of us have ended up with a similar view, is because we've just been hit with the same teaching over and over and over for many decades now. And the components essentially are the rapture teaching, the millennial kingdom, the nation of Israel, also the coming Antichrist. We're not going to be going into that in these videos as much, but we're going to talk a little bit about the rapture, the millennial kingdom, the nation of Israel. And again, this is not so much only me just giving you some data or content, but kind of sharing how I moved from where I was to where I am, because I held a dispensational view very strongly for the first few years of my Christianity. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about one of the main tenets of dispensationalism. And again, there are going to be nuances within people who adhere to this teaching. But something that's really central to all dispensational teaching is that there's a separation between the nation of Israel, and they would say even the modern nation of Israel today, and the church. There's a distinction. Some dispensationalists, more of the classic dispensationalists, would put more of a hard line there. Some of what are called the progressive dispensationalists would soften it just a bit. But necessary to dispensational teaching is this distinction between the nation of Israel, who is still really sort of God's primary chosen people, and the church. And again, I want to be fair, because there are some nuances within this, and not all dispensationalists believe exactly the same thing, any more than all Baptists might believe the same thing, or what have you. But that distinction is necessary. And in the earlier dispensational teaching, that distinction was such a hard line there that actually God had two different eternal plans for the nation of Israel and the church. The church was going to be in what we would tend to think of as heaven, in that sphere, and the nation of Israel was going to be in their promised land on the earth, and the twain never would meet, like eternally. Ethnic Israelites in the church were going to be in different places, like forever. And some people thought, I'm not sure if you find that in the Bible anywhere. And so over time that's been massaged, and I'm not meaning to be sarcastic there, but essentially not many dispensationalists believe that anymore. But another common part, especially of early dispensational teaching, is that the church was essentially a parenthesis. Like you had Moses working with the nation of Israel, let's say that it's about here, and then we've got this age that's often called the church age, and then all of a sudden Israel sort of reappears, 1948, and then we're dealing back with Israel. The church was a parenthetical between essentially the destruction of Jerusalem and then when Israel became a nation again. And that's really one of the reasons why the church, quote unquote, needs to be raptured in this teaching, is so that Yahweh, Israel's God, can get back to working with just the nation of Israel. When I say Israel's God, you see that clearly through a lot of the Old Testament. Yahweh was Israel's God, and Israel was his chosen people. Now, Peter, and I'll get to this a little bit more in the main part of the teaching, but Peter does something absolutely incredible. In fact, I'm not going to mention it now. I'm going to let that just sit there and have you wonder, what was it that was so incredible that Peter did? All right? So, let's go ahead and get into this a little bit, and some questions you might want to ask people, your family member or friends that and you'll know them obviously much better than I am, and you have to use discernment and prayer in terms of how much you might talk to them, or what approach you might use. You might try one approach with some people that's effective, not as effective with others, and again, use your own judgment in those relationships. Pray a lot. But one of the things you might do is just to help them, gently, graciously, help them understand maybe where they are, because the fact is, even people that are dispensationalists, and there are a lot of Christians that hold that out teaching, they don't always know why they believe that. They were just told that by certain pastors, or that's what their denomination held to, or that's maybe what some of the reading they've done leads them to. And so just sometimes helping people get a sense of where they are will give you a better opportunity to help them consider moving the needle to just a slightly different location. And so you might start with somebody that holds to those teachings. Again, if they hold to the rapture teaching, if they talk about the millennial kingdom, coming Antichrist, the nation of Israel being distinct and separate, and especially if they talk about the nation of Israel now as being God's chosen people, you can be sure that there's some sort of dispensationalist. So you might just say, do you ever wonder why you believe what you believe about the last days? You believe in the rapture teaching, why do you believe that? Millennial kingdom, Antichrist. Again, I'm not going to cover Antichrist in this little series, but why do you believe the nation of Israel today is like biblical Israel and God's chosen people? Just ask them those questions. Questions a lot of times can be a lot less disarming, or more disarming rather, and less offensive than just making statements. And so some of the questions that I will sometimes ask people, and one of them is kind of a joke because I like to have a little fun in these videos too, but that I ask people are kind of questions that I began asking myself. And so you might say, where have you gotten most of your information about the end times? Have you gotten it from a friend, from the Bible, maybe movies and books, about modern day YouTube prophets? You might say, are you currently dead and you just know more than the rest of us? But with those kind of questions in mind, you can learn a lot just from their answers to those questions, and that might help you know where to go next. And so we want to remind people gently as well that that their denomination probably does teach a certain view of the end times, or if they have certain traditions. Because most churches are just like that, and that's not always a bad thing. But I would say I've been in lots of different churches, lots of different denominations, churches that were independent, lots of different shapes, sizes, flavors. You name it. I've probably experienced it to some level. And the reality is that all of those churches probably think everything they're doing is right out of the pages of Scripture, but it's not. It could be a lot, but there's some things that are more about their tradition or denomination. So that's why it's good to sometimes ask those questions. All right? But again, key component of dispensationalism, because I'm going to address this with some scripture here soon, is that there are different dispensations of time, and I'm not going to get into those so much because people mark those out different. Like in the history of the world, there's been these different dispensations of time. I'm not so concerned with that in these videos. But the two separate people I am, Israel and the church. All right? And basically, in dispensational teaching, what happened was that God sent Jesus to offer the kingdom to Israel. But they refused his offer. You might even remember that. It was one of the times after Jesus had just fed, gobs of people, and they wanted right then to take him and make him king. And the way the text tells it, he kind of somehow slithers through the crowd and gets away. And so he wasn't willing to be the kind of king that Israel wanted him to be. And so the idea with dispensational teaching is that because they refused Christ's offer of the kingdom, that he basically, or God's offer rather, that he'd be offered through Christ, that God essentially withdrew that offer because the people didn't want it, and then he was going to bring back that offer later, which many people believe began in 1948 with the nation of Israel. And again, the idea was that the church was going to be in this in-between time, often referred to as the church age, really a parenthetical. And at the rapture, the church would be removed, and God could get back to plan A, working essentially with the nation of Israel. That's a very important part of dispensational teaching. All right, and then the living Christians in the church would be caught up to meet the Lord in the air with the Christians who had already died. And then after the tribulation, often referred to as the Great Tribulation, they would come back to earth in their glorified bodies and occupy the millennial kingdom, along with Israel, and also people who had come to faith in Jesus after the rapture took place during the Great Tribulation. And people who hold this view are not in complete agreement regarding exactly how that pans out, but that's a brief overview that encompasses the main points of dispensationalism. So let's start with the rapture, because obviously this is a key component in the view of many Christians regarding the end times. And I'll be honest with you, I was just, I still don't know a lot, but I knew a lot less in my earlier Christianity, and I thought there were three views of eschatology. And some of you will be able to relate to this, I think, because I've had conversations with others who have. I thought there were three views of eschatology. I thought it was the pre-tribulational rapture, the mid-trib rapture, and the post-trib rapture. What I learned later was that's all part of one view. That's all part of dispensationalism. Did you know that? Some of you may not have known that when you get into other types of eschatologies, the amillennial view, the post-millennial view, and then you get kind of a combination of post-mill partial preterism and then full preterism, which is the view I hold to. But in all those other views, the rapture isn't even part of it. Did you know that? It's pretty interesting to know that, because so many people think, well, that's just part and parcel. I mean, everybody believes in that. They don't. They don't. So the rapture, because it's such a key component, I want to look at what I believe are some of the main texts that are used to teach the rapture. Now, there may be other texts that you've heard people use, but I think these are some of the main ones. And you may want to grab your Bible, or you may want to jot down these notes so you can study later on your own. John 14, verses 2 and 3. John 14, 2 and 3. 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52. And 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17. So John 14, verse 2 and 3. I'm going to go through all these scriptures first, and then we'll talk about it as a whole. It says this, John 14, 2 and 3. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, so that you also may be where I am. So it's the idea there that Jesus would come down and take the saints and then go to the place he had prepared. That's one of the texts that's used to bolster that rapture teaching. 1 Corinthians 15, 51 through 52 says, Listen, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So again, often a common place that people would go to teach the rapture theme. 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17, this may very likely be the one you're most familiar with. The Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive, our left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Okay? Now, in addition to those verses, many would hold that the book of Revelation, singular by the way, it's often called Revelations, which gives the idea that there were multiple different revelations. Revelation, one thing going on where within that John was seeing different things, but it's one revelation of Jesus Christ. Apocalypso there is the Greek, the unveiling, the uncovering of Jesus Christ. That's the idea. But what happens is in the book of Revelation, after chapter 4, the word church is not used. So some have thought, the church disappears and is gone at that point. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. Okay? But in my case, again, you may have had a different experience, but it was almost like these events, the rapture, the millennium. Again, we're not going to get to Antichrist so much, but all these things were almost, and again, I want to be careful how I say it, but it was almost like those things were as important or even more important than my relationship with Jesus himself. That is one of the reasons, by the way, just my opinion, but I think it's an educated biblical opinion. It's one of the reasons I think that in some cases, if not many cases, people can become so angry at people who believe what I believe now, because they feel like I'm stealing their hope. I've taken away their blessed hope. Because the fact is that hope has oftentimes been misplaced on these events, kind of like the finale of a fireworks display, rather than Jesus himself. And so that's kind of what I was taught. I was to look forward to, watch for, and warn others to get right with God before the rapture. That becomes a big part of evangelism. God's going to come and destroy everything, and it's going to be horrible, it's going to be bloody, and the stars are going to fall to the earth. And so you need to find Christ now, because that could happen at any moment. Right? And I was told that. And then I would be raptured, and I would be with Jesus for 7 years somewhere. I wasn't sure how it worked. Then I'd be part of a literal 1,000-year earthly kingdom that Christ would usher in at his second coming. And one of the things that began to be a problem for me is that in the rapture view, you essentially have three comings of Jesus. You have his first appearing, then you have his second appearing. That's where we get the language second coming. The phrase second coming is actually not in the Bible, but second appearing is. It's Hebrews 9:28 is the reference there. It talks about Christ's second coming. And it's fine to, or a second appearing rather, it's fine to call it a second coming. I think we've gotten used to that language. But that's the idea with the rapture. You'd have Jesus coming in his incarnation, and in his first coming, interestingly, Hebrews 9:26 talks about his first appearing really being when he took away sin, really at the cross. And then second appearing would be what we think of as a second coming. Well, with this rapture teaching, you add a third coming, because he has this secret coming, and then 7 years later, his second coming. And as I went through the scriptures, I wasn't able to find anything like that. It seemed like whatever was being talked about in those texts I gave was a synonymous event that happened like at once. It wasn't like there was a secret coming and then another coming. So that's something you might explore. But I was to look forward to all of those events. And I'm guessing that some of you had some similarities in your mind, either from end times movies or books, or things preachers said, and we have this idea that there's going to be this suddenly one day all these believers are going to float up to heaven. For some reason they have to be, not have any clothes on when they go, so all their clothes are going to fall off. Pilots are going to be raptured, so planes are going to run into things. Cars are all of a sudden there's not going to be driving, and just this mass chaos, hysteria, and everybody running around freaking out. I mean, I'll probably come across that, but again, I didn't see anything in this passages that I mentioned or anywhere else that spoke to essentially two second comings, and that's when I really started looking at these things a little more closely. So I'm going to wrap this video up in a minute, but I just want to do a little Q&A on these verses to finish this thought, because one of the things you find in dispensationalism is you have to pull texts from all over the place because they're not ever listed in the same place. For instance, the millennium is mentioned in Revelation 20, but the rapture isn't. You have the text I just read that some people would say justify the rapture, but the millennium's not there. Then there's somewhere else, maybe there's something about the Antichrist, and somehow all these things are pulled together almost like you had a bunch of ropes and you're pulling all these verses together and you glob them up and say, see how clear that is? And it's not very clear, and that's why I had to question this stuff. So let me just do a little Q&A, and you might consider using these questions again with your family members, friends, co-workers, people that you might want to talk with us about. The three texts that I went over, again, it was from John, and 1 Corinthians, and the Thessalonians, and you can, I had you, hopefully you wrote those down when I went over them, but you can go back towards the beginning of the video. What do these three key rapture texts teach about the timing of this secret coming? And the answer, nothing. What do these three key rapture texts teach about Christians suddenly disappearing? Now, you could maybe say from the 1 Thessalonians text where Paul says we will meet him in the air, but from the other texts you really wouldn't get this idea that the Christians disappeared. So again, you've got to kind of bring them together and sort of invent that part. Another question, what do these three key rapture texts teach about the Great Tribulation, since the secret coming happens before, in the middle of, or at the end of it? And again, nothing. I think you understand what I'm saying. You'd think if this view is so obvious and biblical that the events would exist together, but they don't. So you have to pull the millennium out of this passage, and the Great Tribulation from here, and the rapture from here, and so on. What do these three key rapture texts teach about Christians coming back to earth 7 years later? Or it'll be 3.5 if you believe in the mid-trib. Nothing. And what I sometimes call Bible people that write about the Bible, commentators, these could be people online or whomever, what did Bible people teach about dispensationalism before approximately 1830? Nothing. I invite you, go back to some of these older commentaries, and you are simply not going to find the main tenets of dispensationalism there. You're not. Now, it is true, and we're almost done with this video, it is true there seem to have been a handful of early church fathers who believed in some sort of future millennium, but the idea of this church age, a secret coming, and a separate plan for the church in Israel, boy, you'd be pressed to find anything like that. And that ought to at least give us pause. All right? I think we'll go ahead and stop here so this video doesn't get too long. And we'll pick this idea up in the next video. I hope it's been helpful to you. Pastor Joel saying bye for now.